Welcome back to the program. We have on the line Congressman Rick Crawford is with us. Rick, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning.
Always great to have you on, sir. What is going on? What's like the biggest thing on your mind right now, or one of the biggest issues you're working on in D.C. right now for the people?
Well, I think we really need to focus on USMCA. That's an important thing right now. That's basically the revised version of the trade deal with Canada and Mexico, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. That seems to have kind of gotten lost in amongst a lot of other issues. I just came off of my ag tour and visited with farmers. I was down in Marietta at the cotton station yesterday, and this is really weighing pretty heavily on them. And the other thing that, quite frankly, it does, it strengthens our hand with China, knowing that we have this tight relationship with our two closest neighbors, and this should be somewhat of a template for how we proceed in future trade deals. So it'd be really important to get that done. Unfortunately, it's kind of bogged down in more of a political consideration than a policy consideration, as often is the case in Washington. And Speaker Pelosi does not want to give the perception that Donald Trump is winning on anything, and so she's sort of holding this thing hostage, for lack of a better term, looking for a way. I mean, the reality is I think she knows it needs to happen, but she's looking for a way to attach it to a piece of legislation that, produces a win for her and can sort of marginalize the USMCA as sort of a, ancillary type of thing, and the president doesn't get a whole lot of credit for that. And so I think it's largely a political consideration.
You talk about your agriculture tour, and of course we are in the middle of this trade war with China. We talk about it every time you're on the program. We also have this situation in China with Hong Kong, which they're waving the American flag. And, I haven't really seen too many articles. There's been a few now since I originally criticized it. The president did hold off on the new tariffs, and there was all these headlines of, the president bluffing, the president doesn't know what he's doing, he blinked. But and there was hardly anything that said, well, maybe he held off on the new tariffs because it had something to do with what's going on in Hong Kong. I mean, not even, this idea that it's just, that these two things are mutually exclusive. It's just laziness on the press's part.
No, absolutely. I mean, here's what we're seeing in Hong Kong right now. This is 30 years on from Tiananmen Square. And basically what you're seeing is a large number of people, and not a group of people doesn't do it justice. We're talking about a huge number of people in Hong Kong that had been, under the previous government, fully availed of their freedom. I mean, and for whatever reason, the decision was made to return Hong Kong back to mainland China, and that's fine, but these are some people who've been brought up with the idea of freedom and liberty and things of this nature, and now they're being deprived of that by an oppressive Chinese regime. And there's evidence that supports or that suggests that they're moving on Hong Kong militarily. Well, that's what happened in Tiananmen Square. Let's not forget about that in 1989, which was a defining moment, for the Chinese. And the other thing that's going on, while all this is taking place, should be no surprise that they're taking the position that they're taking, China, with regard to Hong Kong. But keep in mind that China is the most, possibly the most repressive regime on the planet. Here it is, 2019, and they're still throwing people in re-education camps. They're still engaged in forced labor of their own citizens, tantamount to slavery. They punish religious and ethnic minorities severely and subject them to this type of treatment. And all the while, we have these people in the United States talking about our good friends in China and how we need, the president's off base, and we need China. It's like they need us in more ways than one. They need our leadership to say, you can't treat your people like that and expect to be rewarded. They need us to be a leader in the Pacific Rim, which we haven't been, but we should be. But the fact of the matter is, and I told this group of farmers yesterday, and all I got was a whole lot of nodding heads, we have to change and retool the relationship with China. I think the best case in that scenario for us with regard to China is that they become a retail consumer of U.S. products. The idea that they're going to be a wholesale destination, a wholesale market, has probably changed. But that doesn't mean that that can't be a significant market for us. It's just going to be a little bit different. We're going to have to go through countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, India, and continue to develop our relationships with those countries and assume a much more proactive leadership posture in the Pacific Rim to address China. But the idea that we're going to just everything's going to be great and we're going to have a great relationship with China going forward is probably not realistic. Doesn't mean that we're disregarding the fact that it's a significant marketplace. It's just we're going to have to change the dynamics of how we engage to access that significant marketplace. And the other thing we need to do is always be willing to step up and call them out on their bad behavior. For example, the things I mentioned before, where they're oppressing the Uyghur minority population in Western China. It's egregious, the things that they're doing. It's 2019, and they're still doing re-education camps, for crying out loud.
It's unbelievable.
And where are these people that decry the president's stance with China, knowing that information is out there and available if they just want to look? And yet they're acting like China is, some sort of paragon of virtue. And it's just not the case. They are extremely bad actors. We've talked about this at length about their belligerent economic practices, and what that's about is less about their economy and more about their military, their Belt and Road Initiative and what that portends, their Made in China 2025 initiative, and how they really want to supplant the United States as the preeminent economic and military power on the globe. That's their goal, and they don't really care how they achieve it. They try to make people think that somehow they're engaged in some manner of quasi-capitalism, but everything over there is a state-owned entity, and it's highly subsidized because they're not trying to make a profit. They're trying to outlast other businesses. Their goal is to put products on the market at a discount and run other companies out of business and other nations, basically, out of the business of exporting products, so they become the premier supplier of anything, whether it's electronics, whether it's machinery, you name it. That's what they want to do. And there are costs associated with doing business in China. If you're a U.S. manufacturer and you want to go put in a plant in China, be prepared to give up all your proprietary information, all your technology. And then within a very short period of time after you've started manufacturing your widget, there'll be a factory down the street that's manufacturing the exact same thing with a different label on it, but the same product. That's what they're about.
You mentioned, we're talking with Congressman Crawford. You mentioned that during your ag tour, you had a lot of nodding heads. So, I mean, I really feel like these Arkansas farmers, and I saw a story, excuse me, with Iowa farmers as well. They really seem to have a mindset that is geared towards patriotism. They realize that the way things have been being done have got to change. Is that your take on Arkansas farmers?
Well, I saw a poll August 7th, so it's not too, it's pretty recent, not very old. Purdue University. Purdue University is a premier land-grant institution. So in the state of Indiana, Purdue is like the University of Arkansas here. It's a land-grant institution that's geared heavily toward agriculture. They put out, conducted a poll, and they published the results of that poll, I believe, on August 7th, and shows that 78% of farmers support Trump's posture with regard to China. 78%. That's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that's when you compare that to the landscape now, the economic landscape that farmers are dealing with regard to not only, obviously prices and so on in the marketplace, but the weather, which was a double whammy, and throughout the Midwest, throughout obviously the lower Mississippi, the upper Midwest all the way to the Dakotas. It's been an unusual year for weather. Some places are still underwater, and they didn't even get to plant anything, and they're reliant on crop insurance and an MFP payment coming from the administration. And yet 78% are saying they're sticking with Trump because he's the first president that has had the fortitude, the willingness to address China's nonsense and their shenanigans that have cost farmers for years and years. And so in the short to intermediate term, yes, this is going to be a little bit difficult. But in the long term, it's necessary. And on that note, let me just explain one other thing. You know, in the United States, when we think about long-term strategic planning, we look out over a 5-year period. China's long-term strategic planning is 50 to 100 years. And so they can outweight us. They've been doing it for years. They're a much older country than the United States, and they view things differently than we do. And so we have to retool our own way of thinking. Are we going to be around here in another 100 years? Then we need to act like it. Mm-hmm. We need to think about where we are in 50 years and sort of position ourselves to achieve those goals. And we're very short-term thinking, and our attitude is really, you know, right here at the end of our nose and not much further. And we need to break from that sort of. I don't know if I wouldn't necessarily say it's a cultural practice per se, but it's something that Americans tend to be pretty much here and now short-term thinkers. And if we're going to compete with China, and that's our biggest threat in virtually every category, militarily, economically, politically, and otherwise, then we're going to have to change the way we think. And so we have to look out a little further than 5 years.
We're talking again with Congressman Rick Crawford. I know since you're on the Intelligence Committee, you may already know a lot of this, but a Senate committee yesterday released a report, an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, her private server. And in those documents, it said that all of her emails but 4 were being forwarded to a Gmail account with a name. And if you Google that name, Carter Heavy Industries, it's actually a Chinese company from the Shandong province. I mean, so you talk about China being a threat. We have Hillary Clinton here, who it appears was sending all her emails to China for them to look at.
Right. Well, this gets back to the whole Russia collusion narrative. Everybody was so focused on that, you know, that shiny object, that they didn't pay any attention to the other things that were going on. I just got through talking about what I believe is our biggest threat over the long term is China. That's not to discount Russia and the things that they do, but I heard an analysis of these two countries recently, and China is viewed as, I mean, Russia is sort of an ongoing regional agitator. That is to say, they're going to find ways to get in our business in various locations around the globe, and they're going to continue to do that, and they're positioned to do that. China is a long-term strategic global threat. So think about that and the difference between the two, and who has the capability to sustain a protracted anti-American campaign, and that's certainly China. And so what you have here with Hillary Clinton is that she's sending, 95% of her emails, forwarding those on to a Chinese enterprise. That's not accidental. That's not what's going on here, and why are we not outraged as American citizens? Why are we not outraged that the Secretary of State was allowing this to happen?
I don't know, but I think we're about to get outraged. I mean, I think the silent majority certainly is outraged by it. And Congressman Crawford, it's always great to have you on, and I appreciate the work that you're doing, sir. I really do, and we'll be looking for the headlines for more info to come about all this.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All righty. Have a great weekend. Congressman Rick Crawford, everybody.